prompt that I think most of you have seen like a version of, if not this exact one. This is from the June 2022 New York State English Language Arts Regents exam. So maybe some of you actually took this exam, I'm guessing so. But if not, they have uh, basically the same prompt in every region, it's just with a different text that's identified. And as you see, it asks you to closely read the text and then to write a well-developed text-based response of 2 to 3 paragraphs, excuse me. And in your response, identify a central idea in the text and analyze how the author's use of one writing strategy develops this central idea. Use strong and thorough evidence from the text to support your analysis. Do not simply summarize the text. So the guidelines again repeat that. A central idea, one writing strategy, evidence, organization, formal style of writing, and follow the conventions of standard written English. So you could take this and feed it into a ChatGPT. I've done that, and you'll come up with a pretty decent essay response. Like not great, but it's there. In other words, this is an essay writing algorithm, a formula. And most of you, like we're trained to write these kinds of essays. Your scores on these exams are an important metric for individual students and for the public school, those of you who went to public schools that you went to. So the reason I'm talking about this, or I have it in mind, is yesterday we had this so-called summit conference, the second one, where English teachers from across Long Island came and visited our department, the Poetry Center, and had a discussion with college faculty. I was on the panel along with several secondary school educators and a couple other English department colleagues. So it's a really cool event. It's really important for college and secondary school English teachers to sort of be in conversation with one another. So that's what that's about. But in part we were talking about like different forms of assessment, and I was speaking to somebody from Northport. I forget which high school now actually. So that's bad. Great Neck North, that's it. Great Neck North High School, about sort of, what are some of the struggles that high school graduates have, like in first and second year in college? And what Professor Robinson, who was with me, and I, talked about in part was like the different kinds of questions that you're asked to do in writing essays or, to work through. Because I've found that students, trained in secondary school, and sort of trained on this kind of essay response really struggle with the kind of, often, with the kind of essays that I ask them to write, where I don't necessarily give a prompt, like with this one, and instead I'm asking them to do a kind of more inductive form of analysis and to, sort of identify a problem and really work through it. My essays can be kind of cognitively painful to write, and I think of that as a good thing, but students don't necessarily. So one of the sets of guidelines that I like for writing essays that I'm sharing with you for this one is called 5 Ways of Looking at a Thesis by an English professor at the University of Michigan, I think, Eric Simpson. That's because this is the University of Michigan. His URL is Michigan. And, as opposed to this kind of thesis where you're supposed to identify a central idea and just kind of like trace it through the essay, what Simpson says is that a thesis should be something a little strange. So for those of you who are familiar with The Princess Bride, which kind of shows maybe when this was written, by telling the story of Wesley and Buttercup's triumph over Infant, the Princess Bride affirms the power of true love. Like, that's a sucky thesis because it's just like so general. It's, first of all, it's like, it's not a plot summary, it's a conceptual summary of like the whole film, right? But also it could be said about any number of different works. It's not really a specific thing about both the triumph over evil and the power of true love. Those are like broad generalisms that could be said about like loads of different works. As opposed to thesis B, although the main plot of The Princess Bride rests on the natural power of true love, an examination of the way that fighting sticks, baseball bats, tree branches, and swords link the frame story to the romance plot, suggests that the grandson is being trained in true love, that it is not natural but socialized. Like, this is the second thesis is much more interesting because it's telling the reader something that they don't already know, or it's like suggesting something that needs to be demonstrated. So the problem with thesis A in part is like right away, like anyone who reads the thesis can't really argue with it, on the basis of their own understanding of the story. It's not like a debatable statement. And this isn't in the 5 ways of looking at a thesis, but it's something that one of my mentors used to say, this guy, Brooke Thomas at UC Irvine, where I went to grad school, he used to say that a thesis should be arguable. And what he means by that is sort of a play on the word arguable, like in two senses, right? It should be arguable because you can build an argument in support of the thesis, but it should also be arguable in the sense that somebody could possibly disagree with it. And that's kind of what you're looking for, is a thesis that's like a little strange and a little risky. So this is the point I wanted to focus on. This strangeness is something I wanted to focus on in this video, because we're not quite up to the thesis yet. We're still at the thesis question stage for this essay. So I'll return to this. So for this writing assignment, this first essay, I've asked you to focus on a part-to-whole relation, which is to say I don't want you to write about the whole story, Young and Brown, or the whole story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I want you to focus on passages, and I've suggested possible breakdowns and ways of thinking about the different sections of the different stories in the not quite a prompt, but the instructions for writing. I just want to click back here for a second. A thesis says something about the texts you discuss exclusively. So this is 2 points. It's one that we're not going to make this about just one story. We're not going to have a thesis that could apply to any different works. But also, and this is really what I was thinking of, point 5, it makes a lot of information irrelevant. That is to say, we don't need to write about the entire work. We need to write about a selection of evidence. So your argument about the work is going to select part of the evidence from the work that you're writing about. You're not writing about the whole story. You're writing not just about a section, but about an aspect of a section, if that makes sense. And at the same time, you need to know the whole context. So you can't take that information out of context, but you still, in focusing on the details, you have to keep the frame in mind. And I'm just going to open up another tab and probably bring this up in Wikipedia. So what I'm talking about here is a principle called the hermeneutic circle. Oh, I can't spell it. Okay, and there it is. The hermeneutic circle refers to the idea that our understanding of a text as a whole is based on our understanding of the individual part, as well as our understanding of each individual part refers to the whole text. A hermeneutic circle means that it's impossible. Doesn't mean that it's impossibly to objectively so I don't know who says that it does. You can look at the Wikipedia. It's often referred to art as well. So in order to analyze a painting, you need to see the whole painting, but you need to focus on details. But those details can't just be taken out of context. Makes sense, right? Okay, enough about hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is like a philosophical term for an approach to interpretation. It's often used in religious studies as well, but you're not responsible for that information. Okay, so back to let's drop into the story that we're looking at now. And you see I have my hypothesis open, but I wrote an intro draft, which we'll take a look at in a moment, and also talk about the genre of the intro draft. But I wrote an intro draft that focuses on the first section of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So really what my argument is going to be about, and I have an essay too to share, a draft, but my argument is going to be about the relationship of the introductory passages to the whole. Um, and I'm going to start reading the first paragraph and then talk about it a little bit, and you see what I've got highlighted. And I'll just read that the first page. In the bosom of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson. So, like, wow. I hope this isn't too steamy for everybody, but look, the third word is bosom, and as you know, bosom is means breast, but it's also used sort of metaphorically, soft place of one of those spacious coves which indent. So it's kind of like the first line kind of announces all of this feminine industry, both the the idea of the bosom, and then this yonic imagery, coves and indentation. At that broad expansion of the river, denominated by Dutch settlers the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas as they crossed. So just to gloss a little bit more, there's this feminine space, and the Dutch navigators, these men, sailors, are coming into it and they're scared, right? There lies a small market town or rural port, sometimes called Greensboro, known by Tarrytown, and there's the suggestion that it's called Tarrytown by the good housewives because the men tend to linger around the village tavern on market days. So again, there's this sort of sexual dynamic, right, of these, of the men hanging out in this place that's been very much coded as female already, and the women feeling jealous of their attachment to this place. Not far from this village, perhaps 2 miles, there is a little valley or lap of land, which is one of the quietest places in the world. A small brook glides through it, just enough to murmur, to lull one to repose. Occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is the only sound that even breaks upon the uniform tranquility. So nearby this space that's so coded, geographically as feminine, there's another smaller feminine space, a little valley or lap of land, lap and bosom. Do you guys think I'm crazy? Because it's okay if you do. And it's one of the quietest places in the world with only these little, incursions, the quail and the woodpecker, but otherwise super tranquil. And now he would be presumably implicitly as Diedrich Knickerbocker is the narrator, because it's found in his papers. But he talks about how he's hunting there, this little valley, so seductive and quiet, and again, it's already been established, here he goes into this quiet female space, and, he is, sort of filling the paradigm, especially because he's also a Dutch heritage of these Dutch navigators as an invader. From the listless repose, the particular character, the sequestered glen, has been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. And, we don't think of the Sleepy Hollow in these terms, but, because it's a hollow, it's corresponding to this yonic imagery of the coves and the indentation, etc. And it's defended by these rustic lads, the Sleepy Hollow boys, throughout all the neighboring country. Some say it was bewitched by a high German doctor. Others that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is that the place still continues under the sway of some witching power and holds spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in continual revelry. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales. I have to skip up in a second. Haunted spots and twilight superstitions, stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than any other part of the country, and the nightmare, with its whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. So I'm going to stop for a moment, but I just wanted to jump back up to this paragraph because he's talking about squirrel hunting there. So he's like that one of those Dutch sailors, and he'd wandered into it at noontime when everything was so quiet, and then as he shoots to kill a squirrel, presumably, as it broke the Sabbath stillness around and was prolonged and reverberated by angry, as it broke, the Sabbath stick, okay, I'm having trouble, was startled by the roar of my own gun as it broke the Sabbath stillness around and was prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. If ever I should wish for a retreat from whither I might steal from the world and its distractions and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know none more promising than this little valley. So part of what I'm seeing here is that like he's, feminine space. He's gone into it. He goes and shoots off his gun, and there's this like total like instant backlash with this angry echoes coming back at him. So he's the one who's like, in this case, disturbing the peace, and arguably he's sort of anticipating Ichabod Crane coming in and disturbing the peace himself. Because this land, this feminine space, this indigenous feminine space is protected by these, what I would style as like pseudo-Aboriginal protectors, the rustic boys, the Sleepy Hollow boys, the Indian chief, who's not pseudo-Aboriginal, but actually, sort of figuratively, or he's a figure of a Native American, and this High German doctor. So all these sort of antecedents for the Yankee invaders, right? Who Ichabod Crane represents. So this is enough to say that there's a lot going on in these paragraphs, and a lot of it, it has to do with these terms of indigeneity, like we've talked about in other units, but certainly like an opposition between sort of like feminine quietness and masculine invaders, and also like this sort of set of defenders. So I don't know exactly, well, I do know what I'm going to say about it, but as I'm reading, if you imagine me reading it for the first time, I'm just like, aha, this is like really weird, like what's going on here with these sort of like this conflict of images before we get to the plot conflict in the story. Okay, so I've said a lot, and this is becoming a long video, but I just wanted to quickly go to the introduction. Here it is. This is my intro draft, and because this is what I'm asking you for. It's kind of like, what's the problem? Like, what's the passage that really sort of like makes you curious? And you write a little bit about it, and you ask a thesis question, and then you lay out some of the evidence that you're going to be talking about, and that's what I'm asking for. I'm calling an intro draft. So this is what I want you to share with one another through the through the discussion forum for next week, and we're using a different discussion forum, broken up into like groups of 3 or 4, because that's the way the math works for this class. So I have a title, and I've taken it from my, from the text. Where's that word? Sheltered. Oh yeah, and it shall. I would not. He repeats the word. Yet I question whether I would not still find the same trees and families vegetating in its sheltered bosom. So I'm taking that idea, the feminine and the quietness. And back to my intro draft. The opening section, okay. The sheltered bosom of Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So this is what I'm asking for in an essay title. You don't necessarily need like the title quote, but it's a kind of a cool way of indicating I think it's cool, what your topic is. And I'm identifying the author and the work. If you want to put 1819 to 20 there, you could do that, but whatever. Okay. The opening section of Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is notable for its tension between tranquility and violence. I just laid that out for you, right? This tension is encapsulated by the so-called headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. So he's in that passage, even though I haven't really didn't really read that part out loud. But in speaking of like invaders, feminine, masculine, like look at this masculinity, look at this headless horseman whose head has been shot off. So, that seems like a pretty serious repercussion for invading the territory. And he's like definitively foreign as, as a Hessian trooper, German, right? On the one hand, a masculine action figure decapitated because his head was knocked off. And, I don't need to get too very far into psychoanalytic imagery to say that, that decapitation is also kind of like castration imagery. You guys never knew I thought this way. Okay. On the other, the feminine passive landscape seemingly personified by a will to inaction. So this feminine landscape keeps lulling people into, dreaminess and passivity. The narrator, presumably the late Diedrich Knickerbocker, voices appreciation of the peaceful spot, but it seems to be impregnated with supernatural violence, right? How does the introduction of this opposition or contradiction set up the action of the story that follows? So in other words, what's the relationship between all of this dynamic imagery of the first paragraphs and the rest of the story? So that's a thesis question. It's going to lead into the development of a thesis that meets the criteria laid out by Eric Simpson. And it's and I'm setting it up just with a really short discussion of what's happening in the passage. So what's the occasion for my thesis question? All right, so none of that upside down triangle shit where you start out with some big generalization, and none of this unarguable thesis like we saw in the Regents, where you couldn't really imagine anyone disagreeing with what you're about to say, and it's not at all strange or interesting, and it's kind of boring to read. Okay. So I hope that demo was useful. I know it went long.